Let's change subject again. It's been a week of bleak headlines, and this morning in Saturday Call we're tackling a topic more serious than usual but of prime importance: the alarming rise in heroin addiction. Our Home Office figures estimate that in the last year alone the number of addicts in Britain rose by a staggering 42%. And this week the Health Minister, Mr. Kenneth Clarke, outlined new measures to combat the problem. Well, we'll be hearing about those measures in a moment, but let me just introduce our, I suppose you would call it, panel of experts. Dr. Judith Morgan, who is a consultant psychiatrist who has been dealing with this problem for years. Roger Lewis, who works for Drug Indicators Project and has been monitoring, basically, the trends and the alarming growth in the problem. And I'm delighted to say, and it's great of you to pop in, Phil Lynott. I know you had a gig last night late in Yarmouth, and you've zoomed up here. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
What I thought we'd do first of all is let's just tackle the basics of the problem first. Judith, what actually is heroin?
It's a painkiller basically, and it's a very good painkiller.
Where does it come from though? What actually is it?
It comes from the poppy, and it's...
If we saw it on the street, what would it look like? Would it be, I mean, it's powder form normally, isn't it? It's white powder or...
White or greyish powder. It can come in various colours, in fact, but usually a greyish sort of powder these days.
Right. Now, Roger, I mentioned there the alarming increase. You've monitored the trends. Is that exaggeration, or is it happening on the streets of Britain?
It's been happening, I think, for about 45 years. 1978 was the watershed year when, firstly, we had a major increase in supply coming from Southwest Asia, primarily from Iran, and secondly, a change in patterns of use. 10, 15 years ago, the stereotype addict injected. After the mid-70s, many new users started to sniff and smoke the drug, which means that the barrier of the needle, which isn't a very nice thing to do, was broken, and it started being treated almost like any other drug, like amphetamine or cocaine.
So one of the problems is that it's becoming A, more accessible, and B, initially, if it can ever be pleasant, but initially slightly more pleasant and civilised to take in as much as you don't have to use needles, there's not the danger of infection and so on.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it is pleasant to take, otherwise people wouldn't take it initially. But as you say, the mode of administration is a lot less, it's a lot more acceptable.
Right, now Phil, you've suffered from this problem and you've bravely battled your way through it. One of the things I know that you're very keen to put forward is that it's not fun, it's not romantic, it's nothing glamorous at all about heroin. What is it actually like to be an addict?
Well, let me start at the start. First of all, I don't particularly think that I was an addict as such. I messed around with it enough, and I know enough addicts. Second of all, I don't think the battle is over. The battle never actually ends with the drug. The frightening thing about heroin is that, and again, without trying to glamorise the drug at all, is that it is very enjoyable to take. It cuts off reality. If you've got a lot of problems and you want to just, so it's very easy to, you know, I mean, it's so easy. It'd be so easy for me to just jump up on television and say, "Hey, this is the pits. Don't do it." The thing that's never put across on television very well is how enjoyable it can be. But in that, after you go through that initial phase, it becomes, then you become dependent on the drug. Now, I never got to the stage where I became so addicted that my body craved, you know, like physically for it, but mentally, that battle will continue for the rest of my life, you know, and in that state, you know, people, I know from being in the rock business, and over the last 5 years, and people in the rock business are far luckier than people on the streets because they have money to afford it, to afford the drugs.
Yes.
But the kids on the streets don't, so that's why the violence and all that aspect.
I think it's important too, Phil, is it not, to say that obviously, as you say, there is the fun element, that it can be enjoyable, but after a time, surely it does descend into a nightmare.
It does, yeah, obviously. And that's what I'm saying, like, that's why the battle never ends. For me, or for anybody to stand up and say, I took heroin for a long period of time, which I didn't. I took it enough to realise, because my life was going like that at that particular time, that I should, that I wanted to be away from reality. And but before it became a physical dependence, now it did become a mental dependence, because any time anything became a pressure on me, I thought, this is the easiest way out. Now I've stopped insofar as taking it on that casual basis, but that doesn't mean that the urge doesn't come back every time there's a bit of pressure, or every time, you know, that it comes around. And it does come around in ever elongating circles, if you know what I mean. At first it's every week, then maybe every month, then maybe every 6 months. You know, but it's a hard...
I understand what you're saying, Phil, but I wanted to just very briefly put to Judith the thought that many addicts, or potential addicts, one of the processes, is it not, that they kid themselves, that they are not dependent, and it's only too late that they realise that they are dependent. There's a process of self-kidology, isn't there?
Well, that's right. People think, people often say to me, I thought that I'd beat it, that it would never get to be my own master.
Yes.
And of course,
and then too
it
late
does.
they find out.
Any of us could become addicted.
Right. Okay, well, let's just briefly remind ourselves. The government have outlined their proposals this week, and these are the 4 basic measures that they outlined. A new maximum prison sentence for pushers will be life. The creation of new drug units in every police force in the country. There'll be 100 extra customs officers to fight the import of drugs. And finally, a cash injection of £7 million to the relevant health services. Judith, are you satisfied with that? Is that a package that you think will be sufficient to cope with the problem?
Well, I don't know that anything's really sufficient to cope with the problem, because it's a very considerable problem. I think that the government is certainly taking it seriously. I don't know about the prison sentences for drug pushers, because I presume that they mean really big drug pushers, because a lot of heroin abusers themselves become pushers in a minor way, and I wouldn't like to think that they're going to be given maximum prison sentences.
But do you not have this horrific problem with the NHS that there are 100 or so beds available, thousands of addicts who need to be treated in hospital?
Oh, that's right. We have a long waiting list to see people, and it's very unfortunate when you get a phone call from a parent, or from a GP, or somebody else who's interested, or from the user themselves.
Right.
And they actually can't get in because we can't see them for 6 weeks or something like that. And it must be very unfortunate for them to discover that they can't get an appointment for so long.
Roger, your opinion on the package? Does it go far enough?
I concur pretty well with Judith. The life imprisonment worries me, not because bulk importers with kilos will go down for life, but the tariff will tend to rise right down the scale, and so somebody who is, say, his friend comes who's hurting very bad, says, can you give me some heroin because I can't handle it? That is supply, and the tariff could go up, so that person can get a custodial sentence, which in one sense could be interpreted as an act of charity, and that's what worries me, that it's small people who are basically addicts and socially supplying that are going to get hit hardest, and that will exacerbate their problems. At the top end, you know, 14 to life, well, fine, but I'm just worried about the knock-on effect down to the small user.
Right. Phil, in the world that you live in, obviously drugs were A, accessible, B, fairly easy to purchase, but it's very worrying, isn't it, the new trend that they're much cheaper on the street. Do you believe that this could provoke even more of a spread at street level?
Quite definitely. And the point that I think that's been missed here is that some people's resistance to the drug is completely different to others. I mean, I see Pete Townsend on the television the other day, and he said he just went near the drug once and he was addicted. Some people can dabble around for years and then it catches them. And they could, maybe they're fooling themselves, maybe they're not, but there is a different ratio for different people. I know people that when they come off heroin, they become alcoholics. When they go from alcoholics, they go on to another drug. Some dependency. I know people that use Narcotics Anonymous, as a substitute for, you know, and they become almost like guru freaks, where they become so totally immersed in Narcotics Anonymous or AA that they become equally as warped as when they were with the drug. As far as the laws that they're trying to bring in are concerned, it will be easier because the rich Iranian trying to get his money out of Iran, you know, is going to be the last person going near the heroin. So the person that's going to be selling the heroin is going to be somebody who is going to be an addict. So all of a sudden the law is that fought with itself because it's there to get the pusher, but the pusher, if the pusher is an addict and the law is there to help the addict, if 7 million has been given to try and help the addict, you know, I'm all for the genuine pusher, the pusher that's just making clear profit and not touching it, you know, himself or herself, you know, they deserve life because they don't realise what they're doing. But the people that are actually doing it, where they actually feel they're doing people a favour rather than see them go through pain, and because they're an addict themselves, you know, they're the people that are easier to catch, and they're the people that will get the publicity, you know, and it'll look like it's all been taken care
Phil,
of.
let me briefly interrupt you because you mentioned Narcotics Anonymous. On the line, I believe we have a lady called Laura who is part of Families Anonymous, who have obviously more than a passing interest in this subject. Laura, what do you have to say to us?
Well, I was going to start off by saying something rather different, but I think I've got to jump in now in the defence of Narcotics Anonymous, because a combination of Narcotics Anonymous and Families Anonymous has quite possibly saved my son's life, and certainly saved my own sanity. And I would say, far from these people becoming, I mean, yes, in a sense, we become not addicted to our meetings, but they have been so incredibly helpful to us and such a huge support that I mean, I wouldn't like to hear of them spoken of in the way that
Now, Laura,
Phil Lynott has.
if I can just establish...
Hold on, let me explain this. I have nothing, I prefer somebody to be hung up on Narcotics Anonymous than narcotics. But, like, to substitute Narcotics Anonymous for the drug to the extent that some people join Narcotics Anonymous and they come away with a holier-than-thou attitude, which almost becomes frightening because they are not the same person that they started off to be. I have every respect for AA, NA, you know, anybody helping anybody out of situations with drugs has to be, you know, they have to be thanked and they have to be praised to the hilt.
That's obviously what Families Anonymous are hoping to do. Let's hear a little bit from Laura about what exactly Families Anonymous do. What is their task? What do they do? What's their purpose?
Well, first of all, they really are for the families. And everybody who comes in for the first time comes in with a desperately fraught, worried-looking expression saying, well, I'm okay, but I need help for my son or my daughter or husband, wife, boyfriend, whatever. And what we try to get across, and sometimes we get it across quite quickly and sometimes it takes, you know, a little longer, is that we have, without realizing it very often, our lives have been so affected by the behavior of the addict who is living with us. We've become so obsessed, mostly because of fear, I think, because there's fear of something that is completely unknown, fear of something that is rather like an incurable disease, that we're operating really all the time in a sense of panic, and therefore, because we're so near the problem, we just have no idea how to cope with it. The first thing, I think, the first most useful thing about Families Anonymous, apart from the fact that everybody gets an incredibly warm welcome and you feel a great sense of friendliness, and you actually see people smiling, which is rather amazing, because you arrive and you expect to see everybody looking, you know, desperately fraught like yourself, and you see people laughing and joking, first of all, and that seems astounding.
Laura, can I just interrupt briefly? What was your personal experience of heroin? What occurred in your family that brought you into Families Anonymous?
Well, my son started using heroin when he was somewhere between 18 and 19. To begin with, I think, like probably most people, I pretended that he wasn't. If I could speak about it to anybody at all, which I found very, very difficult, I would express the fact that I was rather worried about his behavior. He seemed to find it very difficult to make up his mind what he was going to do with his life, what sort of job he wanted. And I would use this as an excuse for a lot of changing jobs, for his increasingly ill-looking appearance, the change of personality, sort of slow change of personality. And this situation really went on for, about three and a half years. I mean, I won't.
So when did you actually realise that he was a drug addict?
It sounds ridiculous, but it's terribly difficult to say, because I think a lot of parents would say the same thing. They don't want to admit it even to themselves, because having admitted it to themselves, they then have to say, now what do I do about it? And I had talked to doctor friends and various people, and I found there just was no help. Nobody could say anything other than the fact, well, in rather an embarrassed way, well, there is a drug dependency unit at such and such, and why don't you try there, and then quickly change the subject. When I did finally have to accept it because of evidence and so on, and, the first moment that you find a syringe, for example, which is just absolutely horrendous. Because, you see, for a long time, I think, like most people, one just thinks, nobody, my son could not be this thing called a drug addict. This just simply can't be possible.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I found, when I told a few good friends later, they all said, oh, but we knew, or we suspected. And,
Yeah. Laura,
parents are the last to know, in a way.
I must interrupt you there a bit, Laura, because I know that the story that you're outlining is a story that our experts here have recognised all too often. Judith, is there any common symptom amongst addicts that one should look out for, that maybe parents can recognise and say, my son or daughter is in trouble?
That's very difficult, because there isn't actually a common symptom. I think Laura described a change in behaviour, and I think that's something that parents can watch for. But of course there are other causes for that, and particularly adolescents are very prone to rapid changes in behaviour. Yes. And very often it's a combination of things like that change in behaviour with perhaps the money side of things.
Yes.
They're borrowing money, or they never seem to have any money.
Okay.
And that's a very common one too.
You can look for. And first of all, I think, Family Anonymous might be very helpful to the families. Well, let's get to the crux of the matter. It's the addict that matters. It's the kid that's taking it. And Families Anonymous are helpful to introduce to the family the problem of drug addiction. There are telltale signs. If you want to look for signs, okay, you can look for the needles, you can look for the things. Look for silver paper. Look for burnt out matches.
Yeah.
Look for change in attitude, money gone, a listlessness. There are some definite things.
Right.
But the people that matter here are the kids that are taking the drugs. It's important that the families, once they are addicted, that the families find out, and that's where Families Anonymous matter. But what matters first is the individual that's hooked on the stuff.
Right. Well,
Not
Phil,
how it's going to affect the family, because it's going to affect the family one way or the other if the guy...
I take your point, Phil, but I want to come very briefly now, because we're coming towards the end.
Sorry.
Roger, what should be done? I mean, we've described the symptoms, we've discussed the fact that it's an alarming rise. If you had a magic wand, what would you do to improve the situation?
I suggest everybody held their breath and counted to 10 and said, don't panic, because panic measures are really frightening. They're talking about parents, for instance. Parents often get very agitated. If parents communicate and talk with their children a lot and have a relationship where they feel children can come and say, things are getting a bit difficult, it may well not happen in the first place. Given that it is happening for an awful lot of people, we need concrete, non-scary information that kids will say, yeah, that's right. They're not being talked down to, they're not being instructed, but they get the information which, as Phil said, says, if you do this, it's going to be very dodgy. Some people can handle it, for a little while, but most people can't. And then after that, so you're talking about prevention, but also acknowledging that you can never prevent everybody. You know, you can't have maximalist expectations. And thirdly, in terms of treatment, I think it's a question to be very Californian, different strokes for different folks.
Yes. Judith, if I can come to you, do you sense that the schools are doing enough to, if you like, fight the propaganda war in the sense of warning the youngsters, even the 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds, about the dangers of heroin?
I think that can be a very double-edged weapon to get the schools to be doing that. I think the schools have to be promoting positive health and other things to fill people's time and to make people feel hopeful. That is the thing that schools need to be doing. I think if schools go in and start saying you must not do this because it's such an awful thing, this will attract certain youngsters to it. And as I say, I think that can be a very double-edged weapon.
Phil, how would you attack the problem now? What would be your...
Several ways. I mean, this programme will probably be interrupted for advertisements for cigarettes, which damage your health, for alcohol, which damage your health. Heroin damages your health. The way I would like, if I had a magic wand, is it has been well known that the governments of the world could buy up all the heroin from the major people that are selling it, from the Golden Triangle to Iran or Pakistan, wherever it comes from. They could actually go in and buy it. Now, don't tell me governments haven't got the power to do that.
Yeah.
But no, there's big money in it. And it's been allowed happen. I think there should be heavier customs. I think there should be heavier fines or sentences for the real pushers. I think prevention is the way. If anything can stop, if it's not there, you can't do it.
Phil, thanks very much. As a final warning, really, Judith, what, at its worst, can heroin do to a person?
At its worst, it can kill. But of course there are things less than that, particularly when people are injecting. They can get hepatitis and be crippled by liver disease. They can inject into an artery rather than a vein and lose a limb. So, of course, it can be very serious, short of death.
And thanks. And Roger, can you see the day when we can beat it completely? What is the best we can hope for?
That it'll peak, that the number of users levels off and people don't continue using anymore, it doesn't spread anymore. I mean, that's happened in the past in some other countries. What worries me is in areas of structural unemployment in the inner cities, you've got a lot of very angry, bored and disillusioned young people, some of whom will say, well, damn it, you know, what else is there to do? And I think that is a real issue in Britain of the 1980s.
Sadly, we could talk for 2 hours on this, and maybe one day we should do just that. But for the moment, thanks to all three of you, because I think you've illustrated handsomely the fact that there's no glamour, no excitement, no real fun after a time. It's sheer murder. Thanks very much indeed. And Phil, we'll be seeing you later.
Thank you.
Well, anyway, that's a tragic subject, but one which I hope has been clarified a little bit by that discussion. And for those of you who would like further help or advice, Families Anonymous do run a 24-hour answering service on 01 if you live outside London, 01278 8805, or write to 88 Caledonian Road, London, N1 9DN. Well, in next week's Saturday Call, a certain change of emphasis, our travel expert Alison Rice will be in the studio to talk about winter holidays and help you decide whether to ski in St Moritz, sunbathe on St Kitts, or cruise to the Canaries when the British climate gets just a little bit too much to bear. What a choice.